Welcome back into the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap, presented by Full Press Coverage. Sap, you like to do poll questions from time to time. Sometimes I think they're excellent. Sometimes I don't care for them particularly. This is the former. I think you had a really good poll question because on theme with the 75th anniversary of the NBA, Sap, you wanted to know amongst your people, your Twitter followers, who's the greatest team of all time amongst these teams? The Celtics, Lakers, Bulls, or Warriors in their individual greatest seasons. The Celtics, 67-15 that year. The Lakers, 65-17. The Bulls, obviously, we all know 72-10. And you picked the 67-15 Warriors. That was the year after they set the record in the regular season. That was the first year Kevin Durant was there, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So these are all teams that won championships. And also I kind of parsed it post-merger. I didn't want to go back into the Celtics who won championships in 13 years. So this was more about post-merger. There's a couple of teams that I didn't put in there. The 82-83 76ers, who were phenomenal. They may have been the best team ever for a single season, but then the next year they lost in the first round. So I kind of left them out. And then the Kobe Shaq Lakers, which won 3 titles in a row. I left them out because in the finals, they didn't really face great teams. They beat Indiana in 2000, Philadelphia in 2001 with Iverson, 2002, the Nets. So they didn't beat any really great
it's
teams.
More fun.
Finals.
It's no fun to put a bunch of Lakers teams or a bunch of Celtics teams in there.
Right.
They get one each.
One each. And also these other 4 teams had like third Hall of Fame players. Like the third best player was a Hall of Famer. Was the Lakers, it was what? Shaq, Kobe, and then a lot of role players. Look, it was phenomenal. The first Celtics team I put in there was the 85-86 Celtics teams. Like you said, they win 67-15. They win 15-3 in the postseason. You had Bird, McHale, Parrish, DJ, and Walton, all Hall of Famers. Now, all at different times. Walton was a backup center, but was still a force that year. The Lakers team was the 86-87 Lakers the following year. They went 65-17, also 15-3 in the postseason. You had Worthy and then a bunch of other dynamite players like Michael Cooper and Byron Scott, and Michael Thompson was their backup center, former first overall pick. The Bulls of 95-96, now that's the Jordan team that went 72-10, which is the best record until the Warriors went 73-9 in 2016, but then lost to Cleveland in the finals. So I left them off. The Bulls 72-10, 15-3 in the postseason. You had Jordan, Pippen, and Dennis Rodman. And then the Warriors team was the first year with Durant there. They went 67-15. They were 16-1 in the postseason. The Cavaliers beat them in game 3 in the finals. That was their only playoff loss. You had Durant, Curry, Clay, and Draymond Green. So I put all 4 of those teams in there to pick who is the best single season team since the merger. I mean, it's tough to go with the Russell Celtics because they won 11-13. I mean, that's a whole different discussion. Right. So I put that out there, and they're all worthy of winning this poll. I think most young people would say the Warriors because that's the most current team and that's the one you remember. I mean, the Bulls team in 95-96, you probably barely remember. You were what, 7 when that?
I remember. No, I do
remember
because I started to like basketball a lot. Probably right around then.
Right. So that was probably the first great team you remember.
But I when I was 6 or 7, it was hard to compare them to anything I've ever seen before because they're the only thing that I knew. I didn't really know the history of basketball when I was 7 years old. I knew who Larry Bird was. I knew who Bill Russell was. But yeah, I mean, I remember that team. They were the biggest thing in sports. They were one of the biggest things in the world. They were. It was like the Beatles.
Without question. Yeah, I mean
So you couldn't turn on the TV. Whether you watch it when I was 7, I was watching cartoons and Nickelodeon, whatever. Any channel. They were still talking about the Bulls, so there was no escaping it. So. Nope. I think that part of this question probably depends on when you grew up or who you're a fan of. It's hard to say there's a definitive right or wrong answer.
The 85-86 Celtics, now I may be coming from a different point here because I was covering the team for ESPN back then. I mean, I covered the Celtics, Patriots, Bruins, and Red Sox in the 80s. And 85-86, I was at every home game. They lost one home game the entire year. It was actually Portland on a Friday night in December. And Portland was a good, not a great team. they just obliterated teams, Jet. Like it would be a fairly close game in the third quarter, and then it was over early in the fourth, and it was a matter of, are they going to win by 15, 18, or 25? They just destroyed teams. They took some nights off more on the road than at home, or they could have won 75 games. I don't doubt that. You had Bird in his prime, Parrish and McHale in their primes, Walton coming off the bench, Ainge and Dennis Johnson in the backcourt. You had Scott Wedman and Jerry Seasting. It was just a team that was hungry because they had lost the year before in the finals to the Lakers. I mean, they were just a complete wagon. The following year, the Lakers won the championship. They beat the Celtics in the finals. So you look at that Laker team, that was probably Magic Johnson's greatest year. Kareem was still a force. Worthy was right in his prime. Tremendous bench. Again, very highly motivated team because they were upset the year before in the conference finals by Houston. If I was to give a slight edge from those two teams, it might be the Lakers, only because they beat the Celtics in the finals. The Celtics in 85-86 beat the Rockets, who had Hakeem Olajuwon, who was only in his second year, and Ralph Sampson, who was totally intimidated by the old Boston Garden. So I might give a slight edge to the Lakers because they actually did beat the Celtics. Although that Celtics team in 86-87, the year after they won the title, they were banged up. You know, Bird wasn't completely healthy, and McHale was playing on a broken foot, and Walton was really not a factor. I would have loved to have seen healthy Celtics versus healthy Lakers in 86-87. That would have been a 7-game series. Lord knows what would have happened. So those two teams in the 80s were so strong. And I always put them in there above the Sixers of 82-83 because those teams won multiple titles. Like the Lakers came back and repeated the next year, which is something that had been done in almost 20 years. Like repeating in the NBA was not a thing until the 88 Lakers. And then now it's become much more prevalent. I mean, the Russell repeated in 1969, and there wasn't another repeat champ till 1988. So the Lakers, that was their first of the two teams, first part of the repeat. So that was close. The Bulls team in 95-96, I think the league was a little weak at that point because you had full expansion. So you had 6 more teams playing then than you did in the 80s, and yet you didn't have all the European players there yet. So the talent, I thought, was watered down. But Jordan was so damn good. Pippen, Rodman, they just breezed through everything.
Yeah, it mowed through the NBA. It
was a joke. And look,
it was non-competitive.
It was non-competitive. I mean, they got up 3-0 against Seattle in the finals, and they kind of took the foot off the pedal and lost 2 games and then wrapped it up in game 6. And I don't know if I've ever seen a better defensive team than that because Jordan and Pippen locked everyone down. Rodman, I mean, you're talking about 3 all-time great defenders. Ron Harper was a damn good defender. Kukoc was long. They played defense at the highest level. And then when you needed a basket, you just give it to Jordan and he would take care of that. That was a great team. The Warriors team offensively was probably the most elite team, right? Because you get Curry and Durant on the same team with Klay Thompson. And they played good defense.
And the NBA wasn't watered down then. Obviously, we talked about how much talent there was. So it wasn't watered down. But they were so much more loaded than everybody else. You know, it was comical. Like, you know, if you want to say the Cavs were the second best team, the team they beat, you know, that team wasn't even close in terms of overall talent to what the Warriors had.
No, you couldn't match up with them. I mean, LeBron could match Durant, right? And Kyrie could maybe match Curry, though Curry's a better player. But who's matching up with Klay Thompson? Klay Thompson, to me, was, in a sense, kind of to the Warriors what James Worthy was for the Lakers. Like, okay, Magic and Kareem are all-time greats, you know, 2 of the 6 greatest players ever, and then you throw in James Worthy, or the Celtics had McHale or Parrish. I mean, these teams were just so deep. The Bulls team was Jordan, Pippen, and then Rodman, who great player, Hall of Famer, top 75 all-time player, but he was more of a role player, a la Draymond Green. You know, so that Warriors team was great. Look, the 4 teams are all great. They're all from different eras, though. I would probably give a slight edge over to the Lakers, only because you had Magic playing at his highest level. He was the league MVP. Kareem was still unstoppable. Worthy was great. And then you had Byron Scott, Michael Cooper, Michael Thompson. You know, you just had a very deep bench. And they played defense. They could play any style. You know, they could run. They could play half court. And again, they had to beat the Celtics in the finals. That was a big thing. You know, that 86-87 finals, Jet, that felt like game 7 of a series, right? Because going into 86-87, the Celtics and Lakers each had 3 titles in the 80s. So this was like game 7. Like, this is the rubber match. They had split 2 other previous finals. This was like it. This is for the team of the 80s, and the Lakers won in 6 games. Again, it would have been closer if McHale had been healthy. The man was playing on a broken foot. Think about that. So I'd give those teams a slight edge. And I'm not one of these old guys that says, oh, the 80s is the greatest era. I think it is. But I also think right now is a phenomenal era. The 90s to me was ugly. The league seemed to be watered down. Again, expansion was in full bloom, and yet the league hadn't expanded and have the reach of South America and Europe like it does now. It was a perfect spot for one guy and one team to dominate for 6 out of 8 years. And give Michael Jordan credit, he did it.
Yeah, I can see that point, Sepp. And I think in terms of, the 80s teams that you're talking about, like, the concentration, I said with the Warriors and same with the Bulls, like they were just so much better than everybody else in terms of the roster.
Yep.
And in the 80s, the Celtics and Lakers, most of the concentration was at least on two teams. And you could say the Sixers too,
Sixers, yep. And the Pistons.
Yeah, that's
San
the one.
Antonio and Milwaukee were good. Yep.
The Pistons are the one of those bad boys Pistons teams is the one team that, I know you only get 4 choices in here that, might be on the periphery of one of the greatest teams of all time. They in Isaiah Thomas and the Pistons cap, they beat the Bird Celtics, they beat the Jordan Bulls, and they beat the Magic Lakers. They're the only team that can claim that.
They had winning records against all 3 of those teams. Isaiah Thomas had winning records in the postseason against Bird, Jordan, and Magic. I mean, that's why I always put him up there. I know people hate Isaiah Thomas for whatever reason. I mean, he can be a prick, but I think as a player, he was phenomenal and a winner and a leader. So yeah, those Pistons teams were really good. I never put a San Antonio team in there because they always felt like they were just better coached and they got the most out of it. And again,
it's hard. Which was their best team? I don't know. Was it early in Duncan's career when he had David Robinson? Was it later when it was Ginobili and Parker?
Maybe the 03 team with, you had, let's see, in 03, Ginobili and Parker, were they on that team?
I believe so, yeah.
I think they were young. Robinson was still there, but they beat the Nets in the finals, right? And their first championship, they beat the Knicks. And 07, they beat LeBron.
In a lockout year.
Yeah, a lockout year. LeBron, they beat in 07, and it was LeBron and 4 other guys.
That Cleveland team was
it was horrible.
I don't know how they managed to get to the finals. That was
might be the worst team to ever make the finals. It was literally LeBron and who. 05 may have been their best team because they beat the Pistons, and the Pistons were the defending champs. I'm big on that. Like if you win a title and you dethrone the champion in the finals, that means a lot. That's like LeBron when he beat Golden State, right, in 2016, because Golden State beat him the year before. I think that's very big, and that's why I put that Laker team number 1 because I
can see that. I think your opponent in the finals, if you're looking at the best of the best, right, and this is what we do when we talk about the best player of all time, it's fair to nitpick little things or details because you're talking about the top of the top. You have to look at these teams are so close. If you don't look at the little details, then you can't make any sort of determination. So I understand your point there. I think it's fair. I obviously would vote for the Celtics because I can't help myself. So
they're there though, Jet. That's not that. I tell you, I saw every game that year. I saw pretty much every game every year. That it was ridiculous. And
no, I mean, my dad has told me that team wouldn't lose to anybody. If you asked him, he would say he would pass a lie detector, no problem. Saying would this team beat anybody? He fully believes that. So, I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, I mean, they were the best passing team in the league, the best shooting team in the league. They played great defense. I mean, it was incredible. And again, in the playoffs, we'd have 2 camera crews up to cover the game. Right. And who got stuck going to the losers locker room? Me. So, I'd go in the losers locker room and, guys would just be shaking their heads like, what the hell just hit us? I got to see Michael Jordan put up 49 in game 1 of the first round and 63 in game 2. And it was like, oh, this guy just looks a little different than everyone else. Like seriously, those
still
2
not
games
good enough though to be able to take the team down.
You think LeBron was playing with nobody in 07? You should have seen who Jordan was playing with in 86. There were like bald guys out there, like Granville waiters, who Kevin McHale dubbed grandpa waiters. I mean, they were just Brad Sellers was like a 7-foot guy who went nowhere near the basket. It was a joke. I mean, he literally took nothing and scared the hell out of the Celtics. That's when you're like, okay, this guy's just it looks different with the way Jordan plays. I mean, Jordan was the thing that made Jordan, and I'm going on a tangent here, but what made Jordan so freakish was like in a league of phenomenal athletes, he like stood out. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like, okay, like everybody out there is like a 10 as an athlete. Well, this guy's like some other number because he's just better than everybody. Like you don't see that in sports. It would almost be to me like if you had a pitcher all of a sudden throwing 112 miles per hour. Be like, yeah, everybody's throwing really hard, but this guy's throwing 112.
Yeah, and I think that's a good comparison. And I think when we talk about that Jordan team, the 72-10 team, and I agree with you that the NBA was a little bit watered down then, and maybe his competition, especially his top end competition, wasn't as good as those 80s Celtics or Lakers team or the Warriors team, even though I don't think the Cavs team that the Warriors beat that year was particularly good. I mean, they were good, but certainly not an all-time great team. What I say about when a team beats in a regular season matchup, when a good team beats the crap out of a bad team, right? Like beats the crap out of the Kings. That's what they should do. So if the league was watered down, then Jordan still gets credit because they did exactly what they should do against a watered down league, which was basically lap the field. They lost 10 games.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, that the fact that they were so dominant, almost it's able to cancel out, I think, a little bit of how watered down the league was. And by watered down, I mean, there weren't a lot of teams that had multiple Hall of Fame players. I'm trying to think in the 90s, the Jazz did. And I know you don't rate them very highly. I think they were
they're
better
Hall
than
of
you
Famers.
do.
They're Hall
but they
of
had
Famers.
two.
No,
I'm saying that you don't consider that team particularly, really good. And they did have a finals game where they put like 50 points on the board, which is
57. They were held to 57 points. Shows you how good Chicago's defense was and how ugly the error was. Yeah. I mean, the Bulls beat Seattle.
But I'm trying to think, was that the only team that had two Hall of Famers on it at a given time? The Rockets had Barkley and Drexler and Hakeem, so they had three.
But that wasn't a winning team. But I'm talking about winning teams. It was Olajuwon with no other Hall of Famers. Like Otis Thorpe and Kenny Smith and Robert Horry was on that team. None of those guys are Hall of Famers. Michael beat LeBron. Michael beat Magic's Lakers, which was Magic and worthy, but that was at the tail end of this. That's still their best win in terms of beating another great team. 92, they beat Portland, which had Drexler, no other Hall of Famers. 93, they beat Phoenix, which was Barkley, no other Hall of Famers. 96 was beating Seattle, Gary Payton, no other Hall of Famers, and then beating Utah twice with both Malone and Stockton, obviously Hall of Famers, top 35 players of all time. I push back against them a little bit. Maybe that's just my bias of LeBron. Got to make sure that Jordan didn't beat anybody in the finals. But we can agree that Jordan beat better team. That Jordan played inferior teams in the finals than LeBron did, because LeBron had to play Golden State 4 times.
Yeah, I don't know how you could make an argument otherwise. Yeah. I don't know how you could.
People will push back against me and say, well, Jordan had more competition in the East. I go, okay, Indiana, Reggie Miller, Hall of Famer, that's it. The Knicks, Patrick Ewing, Hall of Famer, that's it. So, finally, his biggest win, Jordan's greatest championship to me would be the first one, because he broke through. Because his first 7 years in the league, people were like, yeah, this guy's awesome. He leads the league in scoring. He's the most spectacular player. He can't win. And then all of a sudden he won 6 of them. But he beat the Pistons in 91, swept the Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals, finally broke through and beat them, and then went out and beat the Lakers in 5. To me, that's his greatest championship.
Yeah, because beating the Pistons and Lakers are two teams that could have won the championship.
Totally different.
Too, so
different than beating the Blazers or the Sonics or the Suns or whatever. So I kind of push back on that. I think LeBron's faced stiffer competition, maybe equal
in the finals. I don't know that LeBron's ever done that. The beating two teams that could have in the same postseason that could have won the championship.
Maybe 2012 when he beat the Celtics after being down 3-2.
Yeah,
that Celtics team could have won it.
That was an impressive win, but it was an old Celtics team.
Yeah, but he had to exercise those demons.
He did. No, that was
came into the Garden. Yeah, that's his greatest game. What was he? 45, 15, and 7. I mean, it was ridiculous. He was just like,
he single-handedly did it because no one else on the Heat was stepping up.
No, he won that game. Won Game 7. Actually, the Celtics were up in Game 7, and he came back. They won that, and then they beat Oklahoma City, which had 3 Hall of Famers, although they were all young. Yeah, that's an accomplishment. The Jordan accomplishment was that's like the Celtics. The Celtics would beat the 70s. That's a good point, Jet. That's a whole other topic. But the Celtics, when they beat the Lakers in '84, they beat the Bucks in the conference finals, who weren't really in that same class. Or when they won in '86,
LeBron, beat the Pacers and the Raptors constantly,
Right. Yeah. So it's like here you're in the finals, and now you can go beat somebody that's you're equal.
It's not the same as the Celtics, were beating the Pistons in the
right.
in the Eastern Conference, or they're beating and then they're playing the Lakers or the Rockets,
Philly.
Whoever.
Yeah, Philly was the thing.
Have to play Philly.
It's tough to beat two great teams because the other team. Generally, there's three teams.
Well, it's out of your control a lot of times too. Right. You play.
Yeah, you just don't go. You know what? We don't want to play the Milwaukee Bucks. Let's play a better team that they upset. And the interesting thing about that is, that in the '80s, there tended to be three really good teams. There was the Celtics, Sixers, and Lakers, and it just happened the Celtics and Sixers were in the same conference. The Lakers, they went to the finals 9 times with Magic, and they didn't really get much resistance, in those series.
In the West.
In the West, yeah, they really didn't. I mean, I think that one year, I believe it was '88, when they repeated, they actually won 3 7-game series that year. I think they beat Utah in the second round, Dallas in the conference finals, both good teams, but not great teams. And then they beat the Pistons in '88. They won 3 straight 7-game series. That team won that championship on smarts, guts, heart, know-how, and just that other teams weren't ready to beat them. The Pistons weren't quite ready to win the championship in '88, but then they did the next 2 years. So yeah, that's all fascinating stuff. That's why it's great debate. If I was voting, and I can't vote on my own poll, can't do that. I would vote.
Make a burner account like Kevin Durant.
Yeah, I know. That's all I need to do. I can barely handle my own. I'd go with the Laker team only because it to me would come down to Lakers and Celtics because they were so deep. Right. Like you said, that those teams were just deeper than, say, the '96 Bulls or the 2017 Warriors. And I think because the Lakers beat the defending champ, I'd give them a slight edge. But look, any of those 4 teams are worthy.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, last year we were talking about the path of Milwaukee and how it broke well for them, but it could have easily broken terribly for them. And they would have had an incredibly difficult road. Like the first round, they swept Miami, who beat them the year prior. So that was an impressive first round win. Then they played Brooklyn. If they, Brooklyn was hurt, but I mean, it's still pretty impressive. But if they were, full health and they beat them, that's way more impressive. And then Atlanta upset Philadelphia. So if Milwaukee had to get by Miami, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and then, if the Lakers were healthy and played the Lakers, that would have been an all-time, path to win it. And this is what it's going to be like going forward, Sap. And we're already looking forward to this postseason this year. There's not going to be a lot of easy outs anymore. No. I don't think there's going to be a lot of teams where you just they're just cannon fodder because of the combination of, resting players and how much more talent there is in the league. I think the paths to the finals of winning a championship is going to become more impressive.
Look at the East, right? I mean, the East, you've got 7 teams or 4.5 games apart. 1 through 7 in the Eastern Conference is throw a blanket over them. I mean, Cleveland and Chicago have been surprises this year. I think Toronto's been a surprise too, but we both agree it's one of the best run organizations in the league. The Celtics have played really since the first of the year. I believe they're 17-6 the last 23 games. That's good. And then, of course, you got Brooklyn and Philadelphia, who made the major move at the trade deadline. We'll see how that works out. Milwaukee's the defending champs. Miami's well constructed. So the playoffs in the East could be really interesting. You could see a 7 upset of 2. That wouldn't be a shock.
No, like I said, I just don't think it's going to be. There's going to be years where the 1 and the 8 is a comical mismatch. But I'm looking at it, and we've talked. This is a theme we've talked about. Now we've been doing the show for almost 2 years, Sap. That the league is continuing to get better. And with that means that the playoffs should conceivably be harder, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. 1 + 1 generally equals 2, I think.
And until, there's been years, like I said, where the concentration of talent is ridiculous on one team like Golden State. And so, okay, everybody's sort of playing for second at that point. But right now, and last year too, and frankly in the bubble, it's like anybody's game. It seems like, it's wide open for a bunch of teams. There's obviously teams that can't win it, but it is, there's right now, if I'm looking at it, I don't see any reason why, if it's, I'm looking at, let's look at the East right now, why, Milwaukee's a 5 seed. They certainly could win the whole thing. Brooklyn's the 8 seed right now. If they get fully healthy, they could win the whole thing.
Mhm.
Um, Philadelphia, there's no reason they couldn't win it. There's a bunch of teams, and in the
Yep.
West, like you said, if the Lakers get healthy, they could make noise. If Denver were to suddenly get healthy, they could make noise. There's no team that looks like, holy crap, we have to play these guys. We have no chance. We might as well pack it in. I just don't see that happening that much anymore because there's just going to be so much talent in the league because, like you said, or alluded to, sort of when you're talking about the 90s, now the game's proliferated to all these different countries, and kids are getting bigger, faster, stronger. Less people are playing football because of the concussion things. This is just more talent means that the teams should be better.
Yeah, I mean the depth of talent is at an all-time high. Just look at the All-Star game, and then look at the players that didn't make it. I mean, you got a player like Zion Williamson who hasn't played this year, a player like Jaylen Brown who feels like an all-star but didn't make the cut. I mean, there was just a lot of guys that you would think could definitely be all-stars that didn't make it. Then you go
Yeah,
back
good player.
to the
Bradley
90s.
Beal didn't make it.
Right. Yeah,
He was the
plenty of
second
guys.
leading scorer in the league last year. There's damn good players who didn't make it.
DeAndre Ayton didn't make it. He's playing on the best team in basketball. And then you'd go back and sometimes you'd look at the mid-90s and you'd say Chris Gatling made the All-Star team or someone
early
like that.
2000s, Jamal McGlure made the team.
Right. So
Brad Miller made the team twice, Sap.
That's incredible. Yeah. So that's kind of our point, that the league, I think the league, the best period of the league was the 80s. And I'm not the old guy that says because they didn't have expanded yet. They started to expand, with Charlotte and the Heat in the late 80s, and then you got Minnesota and Orlando, and all of a sudden you had 6 new teams in the league, and you didn't have the European players yet. So the 90s to me was really watered down, and it's gradually gotten better to the point where I think the league now, this is the second best era following the 80s. But I think it's deeper now. I mean, in the 80s, it was the Lakers won 5 titles, the Celtics won 3, the Pistons won 2, if you want to include 1990. And the Sixers won. It was like an invitational. Okay, here are the Lakers in the finals for the 9th time in 11 years or 12 years.
I think to that point, Sap, in the 80s, and I think you could certainly make a strong case for it being the best era of basketball in terms of, sheer star power. Dr. J, Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, all playing in that era. I'm omitting a ton of people, but I'm just saying amongst those 4.
Oh, yeah.
And Kareem. And then, but I think there was if you're looking at the totality of the NBA in the 80s, how many teams were well run, would you say?
Not many. No, I mean,
and versus now, I'd say pretty much every team for the most part is well run, with the exception of the Kings and the Knicks.
Yeah, and right. Look at Oklahoma City, which
they're super well run, and they're in the bottom of the league right now.
Yeah, and Toronto to me is the best run organization in the sport. They just continually draft and develop players. So
you don't have the Celtics and the Lakers getting top teams aren't getting the top pick anymore because they're clowning the rest of the league. They were buffooning the rest of the league. The Celtics were being able to draft, great players while they were already a great team. The Lakers got the number 1 pick in the draft, and when they had Magic Johnson already, so
that happened. Well, incredibly, in the late 70s, they had Kareem, Jamal Wilkes, Norm Nixon. They traded Don Ford as part of a package to get the first pick from Detroit, which turned out to be Magic Johnson in 1979. 3 years later, they just won the title, their second title with Magic and Kareem. They got the first pick in James Worthy. I mean, the Celtics got Lenny Bias with the second pick. It was basically the Celtics, Lakers, and about 6 other teams. The Sixers were well run. The Pistons were pretty well run after they kind of changed ownership and whatever. The Bucks were really well run, but they couldn't quite break through. San Antonio, there were a few teams. Denver was,
but there's nobody who was the Celtics and Lakers were comically lapping the field. And the Sixers were well run, were really well run too.
Were there too, yeah. And every time there was a player, I mean, I never forget the day I was working at Time Warner Cable and I was, freelancing for ESPN, and I got a call from the Celtics. This is how, this was 1983, so it wasn't there was no Twitter or email.
Right. You
got a call from the publicity office. It was one of the guys that worked in the publicity office and said, "Yeah, I just want to," and I was on a callback list. We just want to let you know the Celtics have just traded Rick Roby for Dennis Johnson, and I'm like, "Is this a joke?"
Yeah, it's it's ridiculous. They were just adding players for nothing.
Yeah, It was like Red Auerbach called Phoenix and said, "Yeah, we'll give you Rick Roby for Dennis Johnson." Okay, that sounds like a good trade.
I was like, Phoenix. Oh, I get to be on the phone with Red Auerbach. Will you send me an autograph too?
And you know what, Jet? Phoenix was a pretty well-run organization with Jerry Colangelo. That was a pretty well-run organization. They had grown tired of Dennis Johnson, and they took Rick Roby because Phoenix had always been small. So they said, "Okay, we're going to get a big guy," and Rick Roby was the quintessential backup center. Like give you 14 to 16 minutes a game. Like he was a physical player, nothing more, nothing less. And yeah, and I was like, I think it was John, I forget who it was, John Riley, who was working in the publicity office. I said, Johnny, is this a joke? And they didn't have like a press conference or anything else. Right. I mean, they just announced it. And then you saw Dennis Johnson at camp. And I'm like, wow, but that's an illustration. And like the 76ers, who always got close, they said, okay, we got to go get Moses Malone. And they put together like this kind of not that impressive a package to get Moses Malone, who at the time was arguably the best player in the sport. You know, that'd be like the Lakers saying, you know what, we're going to go get Joel Embiid and we're going to give the 76ers like some spare parts and we'll get Joel Embiid and we'll be fine. That's exactly
even like SAP, even like in the early, mid 2000s, that sort of stuff was still happening. Like, I still think the Celtics put together a decent package for Kevin Garnett, but obviously it turned out to not be that great. And the Lakers put together not a good package for Pau Gasol. Marc Gasol ended up being better than anybody. He was essentially a throw-in. No one thought he was going to be a very good player. He was a second-round pick. He looked fat on the Lakers. He looked like he was going to wash out of the league. That was an accident that he ended up being good, really good player.
Right, but you got
Pau Gasol for guys who weren't playing, and Celtics got Kevin Garnett for basically Al Jefferson and a bunch of guys who washed out of the league. So it was still happening, but I don't think that's going to happen anymore.
Well, here's the thing. I think, first of all, the game is now global, right? So you've got a better talent pool, but you've also got a better pool of executives. And now you've got, analytics involved, which can be a good and a bad thing. But also the value of these franchises is so high that if someone's going to lay out $1.5–2 million, they're going to try to run this right. I mean, Houston Rockets sold for what, $2.2 billion, as did the LA Clippers. Those guys are going to want to run things.
Well, like I was saying, the Warriors, try as they might, they're not getting, like you said, Joel Embiid or Giannis added to their team in a trade. It's not happening.
No.
Maybe 15, 20 years ago, you could say, okay, one of these teams might be really stupid and just give it up. But it seems like that's over with. And now we talk about this all the time. The player movement, it's much more likely that a team like Phoenix or Golden State would add a superstar player via free agency and him choosing to make a super team than being able to trade for them now.
Yeah, no, teams aren't just giving away players. It's a completely different league. So now you have the talent spread out more so. So now, and that's good for the league in a sense that, super teams are cool. I mean, they're great to talk about, but now you can go into the postseason this year not saying, well, Golden State's going to win. There's no way they're going to lose. Now it's kind of wide open. You got Phoenix, Golden State in the West. But like we said, if Kawhi comes back and Paul George is healthy, who the hell wants to play the Clippers? And if LeBron and Anthony Davis are healthy, who the hell wants to play the Lakers? And then we know the East is so deep, Chicago or Cleveland might be a tough out in the postseason because they're overperforming this year, but they're pretty darn good. That's great for the league. That works.
Well, what was funny, Sap, what I was just thinking about too is like, okay, so like you said, the Celtics would get Dennis Johnson or they get Bill Walton or something like that. And they wouldn't have to give up draft capital to do that. So they'd end up with, the second pick and get Len Bias. And we all know what happened there. But, if Len Bias was healthy, I'm sure the Celtics would have ripped off a couple more titles. The Lakers don't have to give up draft picks. They end up with the first pick. Like now, if the Celtics want Dennis Johnson now, say, just fast forward, they'd have to give up like 2 or 3 first-round picks for him. Like you're not going to get, you don't get, the Celtics and the Lakers were getting both. They were getting great picks and great players. They were giving up nothing.
Jed, Dennis Johnson was like a 7-time All-Star. He was first or second team All-NBA like 4 times.
Right. Like what's the trade demand on him in 2022?
Oh, 2 firsts, a young player and an established starter or established veteran. I mean, Dennis Johnson he didn't make the diamond anniversary team. I mean, I think he was just on the outside looking in, but like he's a Hall of Famer.
Look at what the Celtics gave up for Derek White. And I like Derek White. He's not Dennis Johnson.
No, Dennis Johnson's a much better player than Derek White. Yeah, had to give up a lot.
They gave
future
up
pick swaps, whatever.
Yeah, future pick, a pick swap, a guy, Langford, who's been a starter, a young guy who with potential.
Yeah.
A starter in Richardson. They gave up
Yeah.
a lot. So that's the ask now. It's not the same.
Well, pick a guy that played. I'm trying to think who a comp for Dennis Johnson would be today. Someone who played in the All-Star game Sunday. But pick a guard. I mean, I was going to say C.J. McCollum. He didn't even make the All-Star team, but Dennis Johnson was better. I wouldn't even know who to go.
Right.
Just say Klay Thompson. I mean, totally different players. I mean, Dennis Johnson couldn't shoot like Klay Thompson, but Dennis Johnson was a great passer. He hit big shots, great defender. But just say, Klay Thompson fell out of love with Golden State and they decided to move him. They'd get a ton for him. They wouldn't get Rick Roby. I mean, that literally was the trade. Rick Roby for Dennis Johnson. I'm like, is this a joke? And no, it wasn't. And then that very first year at the Celtics, Dennis Johnson won a title. He'd won a title in Phoenix. I mean, Larry Bird has said that Dennis Johnson is the best player he ever played with.
He did.
Yeah. Right. So and Larry Bird is not prone to hyperbole. So and I love that. Dennis Johnson was one of my favorite players. He was also one of the coolest guys I've ever dealt with. Like after games, win or lose, very approachable. Would take time out with you. Just one of the only guys that you'd meet somewhere else outside of like the locker room, and he'd remember who you were. He was a really cool guy. It was so sad that he died at, I think, 53.
Yeah, and he missed his Hall of Fame.
He missed his Hall of Fame. It was like, Jesus, it was so sad, but he was tough, man. He was. I know you love Marcus Smart. Dennis Johnson. I think Dennis Johnson is what everyone thinks Marcus Smart could be. Because Dennis Johnson was a shooter, great passer, great defender, and like in big moments, he was great player.
Like Sap, how did Michael Thompson end up on the Lakers?
Oh, it was probably like a backup center. Like I don't even remember, but it might have been Frank.
Oh, here we go. I got it. Yeah, Frank Burkowski and
Frank
Peter Gaudmanson.
Yeah, from Michael Thompson, who in 1978. Same draft class as Larry Bird, was the first pick in the draft. Michael Thompson was really good. Not quite as good as Klay, his son, but he was good. You got him, Frank. How the hell did I remember that? Frank Burkowski.
That's pretty good.
That is good. I pull more stuff out of my ass than I know what sometimes. Maybe part of it is I'm on the Punta Cana, 12-day thing like Aaron Rodgers. I'm on day 2. So if I need to, go to the bathroom, I'll let you know. But I pulled that one out of my ass. Frank Burkowski and some other guy I'd never heard of, from Michael Thompson. Michael Thompson, I mean, he was the backup to Kareem, but they would also play them together at times, so they'd be like twin towers. That guy was a damn good player.
Yeah, so like I said, the league is just, it's different, and you're looking at, that's why it's fun to compare, eras with the 75th anniversary of the league and compare players and stuff. There's all this stuff you can look at. Teams are more well run now, except for the Kings. And the Kings would fit in perfectly in the 80s. They'd be in the exact same spot. Any era, they would be poorly run. But there's also that, like I said, more of a concentration of talent on a couple of teams. So the path was maybe harder for some teams. So there's, like I said at the top, Sap, there's no wrong way to answer your poll question, but every team on that has a legitimate argument. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you can't go wrong. And look, the 82, 83, 76ers, any of the Kobe, Shaq, Lakers teams, even like you brought
Bad Boys, Pistons teams,
Bad Boys, Pistons. But I think the Lakers, because they beat the defending champs, would be my choice. But yeah, I mean, how do you pick against Michael Jordan? How do you pick against Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, and Klay Thompson? How do you pick against Larry Bird and those guys? I mean, they're all-time great teams.
Yeah. Without a doubt. So I think fun question, and I'd love to hear everybody's answers, on not just to click on the poll, but to respond to on why you think that. So check that out on Sap's Twitter at JohnSap25. And that's going to do it for us here at the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap. As always, we're presented by Full Press Coverage. Go check out their website for lots of other great podcasts and content. And make sure you check out, like I said, Sap's Twitter. My Twitter is at Jet Stryer. And you can find the show wherever podcasts are found. Just search the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap. Appreciate y'all listening, and we will be back later with a new pod. See you, everybody.